A blind bride recognized him by his bootsteps after 22 years. The boards on Nora Callum's porch had always talked. I knew that before I set foot on the first one. Knew it the way a man knows the weight of a thing he put down a long time ago and hasn't picked up since, in the palms, not the head. Third board from the steps had a hollow sound to it, like something rotted underneath but not all the way through. Second board from the door shifted left, a quarter inch, maybe less. Used to make it pop if you caught it heel first. I'd crossed that porch so many times as a young man I could walk it blind in the dark and never make a sound if I wanted. Toe to heel, heel to toe. I'd learned it because her father didn't always know I was there, and sometimes it was important that he didn't. I didn't try to be quiet this time. I was 51 years old, trail-worn and whittled down to something that barely resembled the man who'd stood on this same ground in June of 1871. My left knee had been broken so bad in a mining camp outside Laramie that it healed crooked, and every step I took, every single one, came down just a fraction harder on the outside of my boot heel. A slight drag, a sound like a man who's carrying something that doesn't show. I didn't know she'd know that sound until she said my name. I hadn't knocked yet, hadn't even made it to the door. I was 2 steps shy of it, standing in the afternoon light with my hat in my hands and my chest so tight I thought I might just turn around and ride back the way I came. Thought that seriously. Had been thinking it the last 4 miles up the road from Elbow Creek. But then the door opened, pulled inward, which was the way it had always opened, not outward like most, and Nora was standing there in a cotton dress the color of creek water, and she said, "Caleb." Not a question, just my name, flat and certain the way you name a thing you know. Her eyes were open, pale gray, and they didn't find me. They'd never find anything again, I knew that. I'd known it since word reached me through 3 separate men in 3 separate towns over the course of 2 years, each one not sure whether I already knew or not. The fever, the inflammation, something in the optic nerve that the doctor in Cheyenne had a long Latin name for and no fix for. She'd gone dark, they said, completely. Sometime in the spring of 1874. She was 46 now, same age as me. Your knee healed crooked, she said. She wasn't moving to let me in, wasn't moving back, just standing there with one hand on the door frame. I heard you coming up the hill. Nora. You sound like you want me to be surprised, she said. I'm not surprised. That was a lie. I could see it in the small muscle under her jaw. She was composed and she was steady, but she was not entirely surprised in the way she was pretending to be. She was surprised the way you're surprised when something you knew was coming finally arrives, and you find you weren't as ready as you thought. I didn't say that. I just stood there with my hat turning slow in my hands. She finally stepped back. Come in then. I'd left in the spring of 1871. It wasn't anything I was proud of. Hadn't been then, wasn't now. But that's the thing about the things you carry the longest. Pride doesn't have much to do with why they stick. Nora and I had grown up on adjacent properties out in the Sweetwater Valley. Her family ran cattle. Mine ran what remained of a cattle operation my father had half ruined through drink and the other half through stubbornness. We'd known each other the way country children know each other, completely and practically, the way you know a person when you've watched them work and been cold together and eaten meals at the same table for 15 years. We'd been promised to each other in that way that didn't involve a ring or a formal asking, but was understood the same way the seasons were understood. It was going to happen. Everyone knew it was going to happen. Then my father died in February of 1871 and left me a ranch that was more debt than land. And I was 28 years old and I was scared down to my boot soles in a way I couldn't admit to anyone, least of all to Nora, because she was the one I most needed to not see me scared. Nora's family had money enough. Not rich, but solid. And I wasn't going to come to her as a man with a hollowed-out operation and a name that owed money in 3 counties and no clear way forward. That was what I told myself then. It was true as far as it went. It just didn't go far enough. The rest of it was that I was 28 and restless, and there was something loose in my chest that I hadn't yet figured out how to settle, and the idea of staying in the Sweetwater Valley and becoming exactly what my father had been, a man who worked a piece of ground until it and he were both used up, that idea sat on me like a stone. I told myself I'd go west, get right financially, come back in 2 or 3 years a man who could look her father in the eye. I told myself that so many times I almost believed it. I didn't tell Nora I was leaving until the morning I left. She didn't cry. Nora had never been a crier. She stood on this same porch and she looked at me with those gray eyes and she said, "How long?" And I said, 2 years. Maybe 3. And she said, "All right," in a voice so quiet and so even that it scared me more than if she'd shouted. I rode out and I didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to, because I knew if I did I'd turn around. 2 years became 5, 5 became 10. The first years out I worked mining camps in Colorado and Wyoming, made decent money, lost most of it to a man in Leadville who I trusted when I shouldn't have. Then I went north, spent 3 seasons trapping along the Tongue River. Got in a dispute in a camp that ended with me on the wrong side of a mule kick that took my left knee apart. 6 weeks laid up in a trapper's shack with a Crow woman named Bird Head, who did not speak one word of English, but who set my knee as straight as she could, and fed me soup from a pot that never seemed to go empty. By the time I could walk again, a different kind of quiet had settled on me. I wrote to Nora twice. The first time was in 1874 from a trading post outside of Sheridan. The second was in 1878 from a cattle operation in the New Mexico territory where I'd hired on as a hand. Neither letter got an answer. I told myself that proved something, told myself she'd moved on, found someone, that my leaving had settled it between us the way a slammed door settles a conversation. I used that to keep going. But I kept going the way a man keeps going when he doesn't have a direction, by just not stopping. There's a difference between a man who's moving towards something and a man who's just in motion, and I had long since become the second kind. I worked ranches in New Mexico and Texas, and for 2 years a cattle operation in the Oregon Territory that paid well and went bust when the owner died. I'd been a hand, a ramrod, a trail boss, a line cook when nothing else was available. I'd been sober and I'd been drunk and I'd been in between. I'd slept under more open sky than I could remember and inside 4 walls less than most men my age. I'd never married. Not for lack of opportunity. There were women over the years. One in Taos who was patient and kind, and who I treated badly by being always only half present. One in a small town in the Texas Panhandle who saw through me so cleanly that it frightened me off. What I couldn't give any of them was the thing I'd never figured out how to give up, which was the idea, stupid and stubborn and possibly deluded, that there was something unfinished between me and Nora Callum. And then 3 things happened in the winter of 1893. The first was that the ranch I'd been running for a man named Ostergaard in the Panhandle sold out from under me. The second was that I turned 51 in a boarding house in Amarillo and sat on the edge of a cot in the gray morning and could not come up with one good reason to stand up. Not one. The third was that a cowhand named Tully, who'd worked with me on and off for 4 years, sat across from me at supper and said, without me ever having mentioned Wyoming or the Sweetwater Valley or any of it, "You know what your problem is, Cal. You left something somewhere and you can't remember where." He said it like he was talking about a pair of gloves. I sat with that for 2 weeks. Then I sold my horse and bought a better one and pointed her north. Nora's kitchen smelled like wood smoke and dried sage, and something I couldn't name, something warm and particular that I recognized before my brain had time to tell me what it was. The body remembers things the mind lets go of. She put on a kettle without asking me. Moved through the kitchen without hesitation, without groping. She knew where everything was by position and by the sound it made when she touched it. The kettle went onto the stove with a particular clank. 2 cups came down from the second shelf on the left. The tin of coffee was third from the right on the counter. She didn't perform this for me. She was just in her kitchen, doing what she always did. I sat at the table. It was the same table. I was almost sure of it. Same height, same slight lean to the left. There were 2 chairs now instead of the 4 her family had kept. "How's your father?" I said. "Died in 78. She said it without weight, just information. Mother in 82. "I'm sorry. Were you in the territory then?" "Texas." She nodded. Poured water when the kettle sounded, set the cups down without spilling. She set mine 2 inches from my right hand, which was where my right hand was. I hadn't made a sound putting it there. I watched her for a moment, then looked away. It wasn't right to watch her like that without her knowing. "You were going to say something about the years," she said. "I can tell by the way you didn't say anything." I wasn't going to explain myself. "Good," she said. "I wasn't going to ask you to." We drank coffee in silence, and outside the window the light was going pale and long, the way it does in Wyoming in late September when the warmth is leaving the air before the sun leaves the sky. A horse moved somewhere in the small pasture beyond the fence. 1 horse. She was running this place alone. "Who works the land?" I said. "I do." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I lease the far pasture to the Hendersons on the other side of the creek. They put up my wood for the winter. Reuben Watts comes twice a week and I pay him in beef." "That's not enough." "It's been enough for 9 years." "It's not enough." She looked up and those pale eyes almost found me. "Not quite. Are you going to tell me what's not enough about my life now? You've been here 12 minutes, Caleb." I shut up. She was right. I had no standing to say a word about what was enough or not enough. I was the man who'd ridden out and stayed gone. Whatever the shape of her life was, I was the one who'd made it possible for it to be this shape instead of some other shape. And I needed to sit with that and not rush past it by getting practical about firewood and hired help. "I came because I didn't have anywhere else to go," I said. "I want you to know that's the honest answer." She turned her cup a quarter turn. "I know. But it's not the only reason." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you have money?" "Some, enough to last a while." "There's a room off the back of the barn. It's dry. There's a cot. You can stay there while we figure out what you are to this place." I looked at her. "Don't make that face," she said. "You can't see my face." "I can hear it." She stood and carried her cup to the counter, set it down with the same unhurried precision. "I'm not taking you back in this house because you showed up. I'm not a prize you just ride back to collect after 22 years. I'm telling you there's a room and you can earn what you take from this place the way anyone would, and we'll see." "Nora." "We'll see, Caleb." She turned toward the window, even though there was nothing through it she could see. "I've been seeing just fine without eyes for 19 years. I've been making do without you for 22. You don't get to just walk back in." "I know that." "Good." She reached for the counter, not to steady herself, just a habit, a way of orienting. "Go put your horse up. There's feed in the left bin, the one with the loose latch. Don't force it or it breaks." I got up. I put my hat on. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the back of the chair. "Thank you, Nora," I said. She didn't answer, but she didn't tell me to go either. The room off the back of the barn was exactly what she'd said it was. Dry, cot, a lantern on a hook. There was a small window that looked out over the south pasture, and through it I could see the last light going out of the sky, pink and thin, with one long cloud stretched across it like a scar. I lay on the cot with my boots still on and stared at the ceiling. There was a knot in one of the boards overhead, a dark oval surrounded by rings. I lay there and looked at it until I couldn't see it any more in the dark, and then I just lay in the dark. 22 years. A man can cross a lot of ground in 22 years and still end up more or less where he started. That's a hard thing to reckon with. I reckoned with it there in the dark, without the whiskey I'd have reached for 2 years ago, without the movement that I'd used for 2 decades to keep from sitting still long enough to feel the full weight of things. There was nothing to do but lie there and let it come. I'd wasted so much time. That was the plain truth of it, stripped of any story I'd been telling myself. A woman had been waiting, not in the pathetic sense, not in the sense of a woman who'd given up living. Nora wasn't that, but waiting in the sense of never quite closing that door all the way, which is different and probably harder. And I'd been out in the world convincing myself I was becoming something worth coming back as, when the truth was I'd been running the same circuit for 20 years because I didn't have the courage to stop. I'd know that the minute she said my name. The way she'd said it, flat and certain, already prepared, which meant some part of her had always known I'd come back, which meant some part of her had always, despite everything, despite the silence and the years, still been holding that open. And I had no idea what to do with that. It made me feel like the man I'd been at 28, scared and not able to admit it, and also like a man of 51 who knew exactly what fear looked like from the inside and was done letting it run things. I went asleep with the knot in the ceiling board somewhere above me in the dark, and I slept better than I had in years. She was already up when I came out in the morning. I found her at the chicken coop, moving through the small flock by memory and by the sound of them, scattering feed from her apron with an even, practiced motion. The rooster watched me from the fence post with the particular contempt roosters have for men they haven't decided about yet. I fixed the latch on the left feed bin before I did anything else. Then I found the woodpile and split 2 hours worth of wood, because it was something that needed doing and didn't require being asked. The axe was good, not mine, not familiar but balanced well and sharp. I found a rhythm in it. A man can get right inside a rhythm like that, where there's nothing but the grain of the wood and the weight of the axe and the specific satisfying crack of a clean split. I hadn't done that kind of work in a while. My body remembered it before my mind did. Nora came around the side of the house and stopped when she heard the axe. She stood there for a moment listening. Then she said, "There's breakfast." The kitchen, biscuits and salt pork and coffee, which she'd made without asking whether I wanted it. I sat down across from her and we ate without talking much. She ate neatly, unhurried, using the position of things on the plate to keep herself oriented. She'd had 19 years of practice. It showed. "Reuben's coming this afternoon," she said. "I'll be here." "I'm not asking you to be here. I'm informing you so you don't think a strange man has wandered onto the property and do something rash." "I don't do rash things." She looked up with those gray eyes that didn't focus. "You left a woman you were going to marry with one morning's notice and no real explanation. You were gone for 22 years without writing more than twice. If that's your definition of not rash, I'd like to know what rash looks like to you." I didn't have an answer for that. "Eat your biscuit," she said. Reuben Watts was a stocky, quiet man in his late 30s with a weathered face and careful eyes. He looked me over when he came into the yard, looked at Nora, and then looked at me again with the kind of assessing calm that men develop when they've spent time around situations that can go wrong fast. "This is Caleb," Nora said. "He'll be helping for a while." Reuben nodded once, kept his opinions where they were. We worked together that afternoon. The south fence had 2 posts that had softened at the base and needed pulling and resetting, and there was a section of the pasture gate that had warped and wouldn't latch right. Reuben worked without wasting motion, and without talking unless there was a reason to, which suited me fine. By the time the light started to go, we'd reset the posts and rehanged the gate, and cleared a section of drainage ditch that had gotten silted up along the east side. He paused before he got on his horse to leave, and looked at me for a moment. "She going to be all right," he said. He said it quietly. "I'm not going to hurt her," I said. "That's not exactly what I asked." I looked at him. "I know," I said. "I'll do better than I have." He held my eyes for a moment longer, then nodded and rode out. The weeks went like that. I moved from the barn room into the house by the third week, into the back room that had been her parents' room, with her at one end of the house and me at the other. That was her arrangement, and I didn't argue with it. We ate together, worked together, were sometimes in the same room in the evening when she sat with her hands busy at whatever she was mending, and I read to her from whatever book happened to be on the shelf. She'd done a lot of listening to books since losing her sight, had a kind of organized relationship with them, knew where each one was on the shelf by its position and thickness, could tell me within a few pages how far through one she was by the feel of it in her hands. I'd never been much of a reader, but reading aloud is a different thing from reading to yourself. It slows you down, makes you hear what's on the page instead of just running your eyes across it. She'd correct me sometimes when I stumbled over a word or put the emphasis in the wrong place. She'd remember passages from 50 pages back. She had a fierce, precise, well-organized mind, which I'd always known, and 19 years of not being able to take the easy route through a room or a conversation had honed it to something finer. I learned things about her in those first weeks that I'd never known in the years before I left. That she could tell time by the sound of the birds, that she knew which horse was which by the rhythm of its hooves, that she'd taught herself to bake bread entirely by weight and feel and smell, because sight had never been strictly necessary for that, and so losing it hadn't changed things much. That she had opinions on range management, and on cattle breeding that were sharp and specific and based on years of close listening to men who worked the land near her. And she learned things about me, or relearned them. The cadence of the way I talked, the particular sound my chair made when I pushed back from the table, that I got up in the night sometimes and walked because sleep didn't always come and never had. One night in October I came in from one of those night walks, and she was sitting at the kitchen table. No candle, she didn't need one, just sitting there in the dark with her hands folded. "Can't sleep," I said. "I sleep fine," she said. "I heard you go out. I was waiting to make sure you came back." I stood in the doorway. "Don't make it something it isn't," she said. "I'm not tracking you, I just listened for you." I sat down across from her in the dark. "I'm going to say something," I said, "and I want you to let me finish before you answer." A pause. "All right. I know I have no right to ask for anything. I know that the shape of things between us right now is exactly as much as you're willing to give, and that's the right amount, and I'm not arguing with it. And I know that I am the reason things are this way and not some other way, and I'm going to be carrying that for the rest of my life regardless of how things go." She didn't say anything. In the dark I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could feel the quality of her listening. "But I want you to know that I am here," I said. "Not because I don't have somewhere else to go. I said that when I arrived and it was true then, but it's not the whole truth now. I am here because this is the place I should have come back to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, because you are the person I should not have left, and I knew it when I left, and I was too scared and too stupid and too proud to turn around, and then I was too ashamed, and then I was just continuing." The dark was quiet. "I am not going to leave again," I said. "I want you to know that, not as a promise you have to hold me to, just so you know." She was quiet for a long time. Then she put her hands flat on the table and she said, "Do you know what the worst of it was?" "Tell me." "It wasn't the leaving," she said. "I knew you'd have to go, one way or another. I could feel that in you long before you went. Men get something in them sometimes, a hook that pulls them toward the horizon, and it doesn't mean they're bad men, it just means they're unfinished. I knew you were unfinished. I thought I could wait for you to get finished." "Nora." "Let me finish," she said, using my words back at me, quiet and precise. "The worst of it wasn't the leaving. It was not knowing whether you'd come back, whether I'd held myself ready for a man who was never going to walk up that hill, whether I'd made the right call not to not just close the door and start over. There were men who would have married me. There were opportunities I could have taken. And every one of them I thought about you, and I thought, if he comes back tomorrow, will I wish I'd waited. Her hands were still flat on the table. The answer was always yes, she said, even without knowing if you were ever going to come. I reached across the table in the dark, found her hands, she let me. They were not the hands I remembered from 1871. These hands had been doing the work of 2 hands and 2 eyes for 19 years. They were stronger than they looked and slightly roughed from work but warm, and when my hands closed over them she didn't pull back. I should have come back sooner, I said. Yes, she said, you should have. I'm going to do better. You already are, she said. You fixed that feed bin latch the first morning. That's been broken for 2 years. I laughed. It came out rough, not used to it, but real. She squeezed my hands once and then let go. Go to sleep, Caleb. There's fence to check in the morning. I went to sleep. November came in cold and fast, the way Wyoming Novembers do, and I found myself glad of it. I'd spent so many winters working through them, fighting them, enduring them as something to be outlasted on the way to spring, that I'd forgotten a winter could be a thing you could be inside of, sheltered from but aware of. The snow on the mountains, visible from the south window while I drank my morning coffee. The particular quiet of a frozen pasture in the early morning before anything moved. The way lamplight takes on a different quality when the dark outside is winter dark. I had the ranch in better shape by the first week of November than it had been in what looked like 2 or 3 years. That wasn't pride talking. It was just evidence. Nora knew what needed doing, had always known, but there are things that require 2 hands free and 2 eyes working and a man's weight, and those things had been accumulating. We went through them systematically. The roof of the barn had 2 sections of shingle that needed replacing before snow weight brought them in. The well housing was rotted at the base and needed rebuilding. There was a section of winter pasture that hadn't been grazed efficiently in years because the fencing had never been quite right. Reuben came twice a week and we developed a rhythm together. The 3 of us, Reuben and me, working in easy parallel while Nora ran the house and sometimes came out to direct something or give an opinion that turned out to be correct. One afternoon in mid-November, Reuben and I were restacking the hay in the loft and he said, without preamble, "She hasn't been this settled in years." I kept working. "Just thought you should know," he said. "I appreciate it." "Don't make me tell her I said that. She'd skin me." I didn't smile, but I felt it somewhere. Elbow Creek was a town of maybe 400 people and a long memory. I'd been avoiding it. Not because I was ashamed exactly, but because I didn't see any reason to walk into something before I had to, and going into town would require dealing with people who remembered me from before, which meant answering questions I didn't particularly want to answer and accepting judgments I hadn't asked for. Nora knew I was avoiding it and she didn't push. But in mid-November we needed supplies she couldn't get from Reuben, and there was a matter at the land office that required a signature, and she asked me to go. Matter of fact, not a test, just a practical thing. She gave me a list written in her careful, large handwriting. She still wrote by feel, lining up on a ruled template she'd made herself, and I folded it into my coat pocket and rode in on a Tuesday. The main street of Elbow Creek looked roughly the way I'd left it, which was to say it had added a few buildings and lost a few others, and kept the same general feeling of a place that was making do. The dry goods was still where it had always been. The land office was new, a proper building now instead of the back room of the old post office. The land office man was named Ketterman, young enough that I'd never known him, and he handled the paperwork without more than a professional curiosity. But the dry goods was Ruth's place. Ruth Pemberton, Nora's friend, and Ruth had been in this valley since before I was born and had, I suspected, strong opinions about most things including me. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with silver hair and a direct way of looking at a person that reminded me, not unpleasantly, of Nora. She watched me come in from behind the counter and said, "Caleb Marsh." Well, she said it the way you'd say it if you'd been expecting something for a long time and it had finally arrived. "Ma'am," I said. "Don't ma'am me," she said. "I've known you since you were 12 years old." She looked at the list I'd handed her. "How is she?" "She's well. Better than well from what I hear." She was moving through the shelves, picking items off the list, efficient about it. "Reuben says you've got that fence line sorted out finally." "That's been a problem for 3 years." It was a straightforward fix. It was a fix that required a man with the time to do it. She set a sack of flour on the counter. "Salt." "Yes, ma'am." She gave me a look and went for the salt. "You know, people have been wondering," she said from the back shelf. "I expect so. What your intentions are, whether you're going to stay, whether Nora knows what she's doing, letting you back on the property." She came back and set the salt down beside the flour and looked at me squarely. "I don't think she doesn't know what she's doing. I want to be clear about that. Nora Callum has never in her life not known exactly what she was doing. I just think there are people who feel they have a stake in the answer." "Does that include you?" I said. She considered. "I've been her friend for 15 years, she said. "I've watched her manage that ranch alone without asking for more help than she needed. I've watched her do it without complaint and without self-pity and mostly without letting anyone see how hard it was." She folded the list and set it on the counter. "So yes, I have a stake in the answer." I looked at her. "I'm going to stay," I said. "I'm going to do right by her. That's the only answer I have." She studied me for a long moment. Then she said, "She always said you'd come back. Every time anyone suggested she ought to move on, she'd get quiet and she'd say, 'He'll come back when he's finished.' Said it for years. Long past the point when most people would have given up on the idea." She started wrapping the parcels. "I used to think she was being stubborn. Now I think she just knew you better than you knew yourself." I didn't say anything. "Don't make her regret being right," she said. She said it without heat, just an honest statement of terms. "I won't," I said. She nodded once, tied the last parcel. "Tell her I'll be out on Saturday." I rode back to the ranch with the supplies and didn't say much about it at dinner. But that evening, when I was reading and Nora was at her mending, she said without looking up, "How was Ruth?" "Informative," I said. The corner of her mouth moved. "She's protective." "She is. She's been a good friend." I could see that. She was quiet for a moment, fingers moving through her work. "She was the one who told me what I was allowed to feel and not allowed to feel when you didn't come back," she said. "Whenever I started going in on myself, blaming myself, thinking I should have held you tighter or said more or said less, Ruth would sit me down and tell me that whatever you were doing out in the world was yours to do and my job was to tend to my own life. She said that so many times it eventually took." She paused. She was right, of course. My life was mine to live. I just also happened to leave a door open. "I know," I said. "I'm grateful you did." She turned a piece of mending over in her hands. "Don't be grateful," she said. "Just be here." "I am," I said. "I know you are," she said. "I can hear you." There is a thing that happens between two people who have known each other a long time and come back together after too much time away. It isn't romantic, exactly, or it isn't only that. It's more like the setting of a bone, painful in the right way, and when it's set, there's a solidity that wasn't there before. You build something out of the damage instead of just trying to cover it over. We built it slow. No rushing, no dramatic moments, no scenes, just days. She told me things. About the fever that took her sight 3 weeks in the summer of 1874, when the world got brighter and brighter and then went out. About the 6 months after that when she could barely function and didn't want to. About the morning she decided, for no particular reason she could name, to get up and make biscuits from memory, and how the biscuits were terrible and she'd laughed for the first time in months, alone in the kitchen. About all the things she'd taught herself since. About the winter her father died and how she'd managed the ranch through a Wyoming winter with a hired man who'd quit in February and Reuben, then only 20, helping more than he was paid to. I told her things, not excuses. She hadn't asked for excuses and wouldn't have accepted them, but the real shape of things, which is different. The mining camp and the mule kick and bird head and her soup pot. The years in Texas and New Mexico and Oregon. The 2 letters I'd sent without knowing whether they'd reached her. What it had been like to be a man in motion for 20 years without a particular destination, and how that motion could feel like freedom for a long time before you noticed it was starting to feel like something else. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interruption, occasionally asking a single precise question that landed right in the middle of what I hadn't said. One evening in December, close to Christmas, I was reading to her from a book about the Lewis and Clark expedition. She'd had it for years and had been working through it slowly, and there was a passage about the Columbia River in late autumn, the cold and the gray and the immensity of it, and I read it and then put the book down without meaning to. She was quiet. "What?" she said. "Nothing, just thinking about something." "About?" I looked at her across the low light of the lamp. She was sitting with her mending in her lap, needlework she did by feel, and she was turned slightly toward me in the way she had when she was listening to something she wanted to hear. The lamplight caught one side of her face and left the other in shadow. "About how I don't think I've been this settled," I said, "in a long time, maybe ever." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Come here, Caleb." I set the book down and moved my chair closer. She put out her hand and found my face, the way she sometimes did when she wanted to see something, and she held it there for a moment, her palm against my jaw, just resting. "You look like you've been through a lot," she said. She said it plainly, no pity in it. "I have. So have I. I know." Her thumb moved once across the side of my face. Then she put her hand down and picked up her mending again. "Finish the chapter," she said. I finished the chapter. January. There was a stretch of 3 days in the middle of the month when the temperature dropped to something a thermometer barely had numbers for, and the wind came down off the mountains and found every gap in every board and every poorly fit door frame and made itself known. We kept the fires going round the clock, rotating wood by the hour, and spent most of those 3 days in the 2 rooms of the house that held heat, the kitchen and the sitting room, doing the kind of close indoor work that deep winter makes necessary. It was during those 3 days that the thing happened with Marcus Glover. Glover was a man who'd been buying land in the valley over the past few years, piece by piece, from families who'd sold when times got hard. He had a face like a good poker player, pleasant and patient and not giving much away. He'd been out to the Callum property twice before I arrived, according to Reuben, and had made Nora offers for the south pasture and once for the whole spread. She'd turned him down both times. He'd taken it politely and gone. He rode out on the 2nd day of the freeze, which told me something about him already. Nora heard his horse and was at the door before he knocked. I stayed back in the kitchen doorway, but I didn't disappear. He did his polite thing with his hat in his hands and asked Nora how she was holding up in the cold, and she said she was fine, and there was a small exchange about the weather, and then he got to it. He'd heard she had a man staying on the property now, he said. He wanted to make sure she was all right. Wanted to make sure she knew that if there was any reason she felt she needed to renegotiate the terms of her situation, any pressure, any difficulty, he was still interested in the property, and his offer was still on the table. He said it kindly, that was the thing. He said it like a man who was genuinely concerned and also happened to want something, which is the most effective kind of wanting. Nora's face didn't change. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "I know you mean that well, I'm not selling." He looked past her at me for a moment, looked back at her. "If circumstances change." "They have changed," she said. My circumstances are considerably better than they were a year ago. Thank you for riding out in this weather." That was the end of it. He put his hat back on and went. She closed the door and stood with her hand on it for a moment. "I could hear him deciding whether you were a problem," she said. "I expect he decided I wasn't one worth making." "He underestimates quiet men," she said. She turned from the door. "That south pasture is the best grazing in this part of the valley. He's been after it for 3 years. He's not going to stop asking." "That's his right," I said, "and your right is to keep saying no." "I know my rights," she said, but she said it without sharpness, just confirming. She came back to the kitchen, and I handed her her coffee, and she sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup the way she always did. Outside, the wind was going hard at the eaves. "You didn't say anything," she said. "It wasn't my place to." She was quiet for a moment. "You wanted to." "Maybe," I said, "but it was your house and your decision, and you handled it." She took a slow sip of coffee. "You've changed," she said. The Caleb Marsh I knew at 28 would have said something. "The Caleb Marsh you knew at 28 caused you 22 years of difficulty," I said. "I figured I'd try a different approach." She smiled then. Not the small corner of the mouth thing she usually allowed herself, but an actual, full smile, brief and warm and gone in a moment. But there. I stored that smile away somewhere and left it alone. The second night of the freeze, I woke up at 2 in the morning and lay there listening to the wind, and then got up to check the kitchen fire, which needed a log. I stood in the kitchen for a moment in the cold dark, and I thought about what a strange and particular thing my life had become. I'd been moving since I was 28 years old. Moving was what I'd known. Moving was what I'd mistaken for living for a long time. And now I was standing in a warm kitchen in Wyoming at 2 in the morning, listening to a winter storm that wanted in and couldn't get in a house where the woman sleeping at the other end of the hall knew me completely, and was choosing, every day, without ceremony or announcement, to let me stay. That was it really, that was the whole of it. She wasn't keeping me out of sentiment, and she wasn't keeping me out of need, and she wasn't keeping me out of habit. She was keeping me because she decided I was worth keeping. After 22 years and everything that had happened in them and everything I'd walked away from, she'd looked at the whole of it, the way she looked at everything, with that clear, unflinching assessment that didn't require eyes, and she decided yes. A man can spend 20 years wondering if he's worth anything to anyone. He can outrun the question for a long time, but it catches up. And when it does, the only thing in the world that means anything is whether somebody who knows him fully, the leaving, the returning, the years, the silence, the crooked knee and the tired eyes and the whole sorry history of it, whether somebody who knows all that has decided the answer is yes. I put the log on the fire and went back to bed. In the morning, Nora was already up. She handed me coffee when I came in, without me having made a sound, because she'd heard the bedroom door and knew how long it took me to pull my boots on. "The wind's dying," she said. I stood at the window with the coffee. She was right. The sky was still gray and the snow was still moving across the yard, but the frantic quality had gone out of it. "Nora," I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm not asking it because I think it's expected or because it's the natural thing that comes next. I'm asking because it's what I want." She set her cup down and waited. "Will you marry me?" I said, "properly, with a preacher and witnesses and the whole thing done right. Not because you need me here, because you've proven you don't, and not because it makes this arrangement easier, though it might. Because I want to be here. Because this is where I should have been 20 years ago, and I am asking you now because now is all I've got left." The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the diminishing wind. She put one hand on the counter, not for balance, just contact with something solid. "You're 51 years old," she said. "Yes." "You've been here 4 months." Yes. And you waited until the coldest week of the year to ask this. Apparently. She was quiet for a long time. Ask me again in the spring, she said. When the ground thaws out, I want to make sure you're still here. I turned from the window. I'll be here. Then asking again in the spring will cost you nothing. She picked up her cup and took it to the table and sat down. She had a slight smile at the corner of her mouth that I was only now close enough and still enough to know how to read. There's wood to bring in, she said. I know. I asked her again in April. The ground had thawed and the first grass was coming up in the south pasture and the creek was running loud from snowmelt and there were 2 new calves in the field, knock-kneed and stiff-legged and brave the way new things are. I asked her on the porch in the morning, leaning against the rail, watching the valley come back to life. No ceremony to it. No kneeling. No elaborate preparation. Just the 2 of us on the porch with our coffee, and the April light coming in low, and the whole valley doing what it did every spring regardless of what any particular man decided or failed to decide. I said, I'm asking again, will you marry me? She said yes the same way she'd said my name on that first afternoon. Not a question, not a performance, just a plain settled thing, the way you confirm something you've already decided. The way you say of course to something that was never really in doubt, just waiting on the right conditions. We were married on the 14th of May, 1894. Reuben stood up with me. He dressed up for it, which on Reuben meant a clean shirt and a tie that he'd clearly borrowed and wasn't comfortable in. He stood at my left shoulder and didn't say a word through the whole ceremony, and that was exactly right. Ruth stood with Nora, and Ruth cried, which surprised me until I thought about 15 years of friendship and what Ruth had probably witnessed in those years, and then it didn't surprise me at all. The preacher was a man named Colton who'd been in the Sweetwater Valley since before I was born, and who had the good sense not to comment on the length of time between our first acquaintance and our wedding, which I was grateful for. He did the ceremony plainly and without elaboration, and when he asked the questions I answered them, and when Nora answered them, she answered them with a quiet steadiness that had been her characteristic way of doing everything for as long as I'd known her. She wore a dress the color of sage. She held my arm the way she always held things, with confidence in where it was and trust in what it would do. And when I said the words, she said the words back in the same low, even voice she used for everything else, not performing them, just meaning them. When the preacher told me I could kiss my wife, she turned her face up toward mine with the complete unhesitating certainty about exactly where my face was that she always had, that she'd always had even when her eyes still worked. That was just Nora. Afterward there was food and a bottle of something good that Reuben had produced from somewhere, and Ruth talked for a while and then cried again, and then talked some more and eventually rode back to town. Reuben shook my hand and said something quietly and rode out. And then it was just the 2 of us in the quiet of the late afternoon, the valley going gold in the long light, the new calves in the south pasture, the creek audible from the porch. We sat on the porch for a while without saying much. Colton has done better ceremonies, she said. Seemed fine to me. He was nervous, she said. He always goes faster when he's nervous. I've heard him give eulogies and he's better when he has room to breathe. I thought he did all right. She had her hands in her lap still. Are you glad? She said. The question surprised me. Not the question itself, but the asking of it. It was as close to uncertain as I'd heard her in 6 months. As close to needing an answer to something she couldn't already determine herself. Nora, I said, I have not been glad in the way I am right now since I was a young man and didn't know it. I looked out at the valley, and I suspect I will be more glad in a year than I am today, and more glad still the year after that. She was quiet for a moment. That was well put, she said. Don't sound so surprised. She almost laughed, not quite, but it was there. The morning after, I stood at the south window with a cup of coffee and looked at the valley. The light was early and pale, coming in at a low angle the way spring light does, catching the dew on the grass and the creek water and making the whole thing shine. The two calves were in the south pasture, less unsteady than they'd been a month ago, learning the feel of ground under them. Nora's horse and my horse were grazing side by side along the fence line, close enough that their flanks were nearly touching in the unhurried, companionable way horses have when they've decided they belong in the same place. I heard her come up behind me, not footsteps exactly, but the small sound of her in the room, the quality of the air changing. She put her hand on my back between the shoulder blades, flat and warm, just rested it there. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I'd thought about that moment sometimes in the years I was gone. Not this exact moment. I hadn't been specific enough in my imagining, but some version of it. Some version of still. A morning and a window and a reason to be where I was. I'd thought about it, and then I'd gotten back on a horse or back to work and let the thinking go, because you can't carry the futures you aren't building without it getting too heavy. But here it was anyway, despite everything. Despite the 22 years and the 2 bad letters and the crooked knee and all of it, here it was. "What are you looking at?" she said. "The valley," I said, "the horses. Both of them out there. Side by side." She was quiet for a moment, processing that in whatever way she processed things she couldn't see, building the image from the information, or maybe not building an image at all but just knowing, in the particular way she knew things. "Your valley," I said. "Our valley," she said, no sentiment in it, no softness put on top of it, just the accurate word said plainly the way she said everything, just the true thing stated. Her hand was still on my back and I put my hand over hers. Her fingers were warm from the coffee cup. Outside the light was moving across the grass the way it does when the morning wind comes up, making the whole field ripple like water. The creek was loud with snowmelt. The calves were moving slowly toward the far fence, tentative and deliberate. There's a thing that happens sometimes when you've come through a long distance, not the good feeling you might expect, not triumph, nothing so clean as that, just a settling, a particular quiet. The sense of weight distributed the right way, finally, after a long time of leaning into motion to stay upright. That was what was happening. I didn't name it while it was happening. I just stood there with my coffee and my wife's hand between my shoulder blades and the valley going gold in the early light, and I let it be whatever it was. That's where I'll leave it. A man stands at a window on the morning after the best thing that ever happened to him. The valley is doing what the valley always does, which is just continue, unhurried, without judgment, alive. His wife's hand is warm on his back. The horses are grazing side by side. He is 51 years old, and he is exactly where he should be. There's nothing else to explain.